In the cold and calculated world of 19th-century European royalty, Princess Stephanie of Belgium was born not as a cherished child but as a political pawn. On the 21st of May, 1864, she took her first breath at the Chateau of Laeken near Brussels, born into the glittering but dysfunctional Belgian monarchy. Her father, King Leopold II, was not merely a monarch. He was a man whose legacy would become synonymous with brutality. His reign over the Congo Free State would result in the death and mutilation of millions of Africans, yet his cruelty did not stop at colonial borders. Within the gilded halls of his own palace, Leopold II ruled with a cold and distant heart, reserving affection only for his male heir, Prince Leopold, and treating his daughters like disposable assets in the grand chessboard of European diplomacy. Stephanie's mother, Queen Marie Henriette of Austria, herself a product of Habsburg royal blood, found no love in her marriage. Theirs was a union of politics, not passion. As Leopold grew more obsessed with power and mistresses, Henriette withdrew from court life, eventually choosing to live in quiet isolation. Stephanie and her siblings, especially the daughters, were raised with minimal emotional involvement. Education was strictly formal. Etiquette, piano, French and German, but when it came to preparing Stephanie for womanhood, she was left entirely ignorant. Subjects like love, sex, reproduction, and disease were strictly forbidden. And so, Stephanie matured into a young lady polished on the outside and dangerously unprepared within. At the mere age of 15, she was thrust into international negotiations. Her father had plans for her to cement an alliance with the mighty Austro-Hungarian Empire by marrying her off to the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph and Empress Elizabeth, Crown Prince Rudolph. Rudolph, 6 years her senior, had a reputation in Vienna's high society that didn't quite match the romantic image of a fairy tale prince. Behind closed doors, he was volatile, moody, and mentally fragile. But he was also heir to the empire, and that was all that mattered to Leopold II. In 1880, Crown Prince Rudolph made a brief yet theatrical visit to Brussels. Stephanie, naive and impressionable, was charmed by the dashing young man. Rudolph, too, wrote glowing letters to his mother, praising Stephanie's beauty and manners, all while conveniently omitting his long-running indulgence in brothels and casual affairs with actresses and sex workers. Unbeknownst to anyone, or at least unspoken in polite society, Rudolph had contracted gonorrhea during one of his escapades. But this crucial medical fact was buried beneath layers of imperial secrecy. The engagement was announced shortly thereafter. However, what was supposed to be a triumphant moment became a deeply humiliating episode. Upon being sent to Vienna to receive royal grooming, it was discovered by the palace ladies that Stephanie had not yet reached puberty. She was physically and emotionally underdeveloped, and worse still, she had no knowledge of sexuality or reproduction. Her shock and discomfort were visible. The engagement had to be postponed, and the teenage princess was sent back to Belgium, not for education, but to mature like a fruit ripening on a political tree. This interlude exposed the failure of her upbringing. The Belgian court had prepared her to be displayed like a jewel, not to survive marriage to a disturbed man in a foreign imperial palace. But time passed, and with it, her body developed. On May 10, 1881, Stephanie married Crown Prince Rudolph in a ceremony that was as dazzling as it was ominous. St. Augustine's Church in Vienna hosted one of the grandest weddings of the century. Royals from across Europe, including future monarchs, like Edward VII of England and Wilhelm II of Germany, attended the nuptials. To the press and public, it was a fairy tale union. But within the first few weeks, cracks began to show. Stephanie, uninitiated into the realities of physical intimacy, was overwhelmed by her husband's sexual expectations. Rudolph, who had grown used to transactional and often degrading encounters with prostitutes, approached his new wife with little tenderness or understanding. Yet Stephanie, ever dutiful, adapted as best she could. In 1883, she gave birth to a daughter, Archduchess Elizabeth Marie. Though it wasn't the male heir the empire desired, it was a glimmer of hope. The couple presented a public image of unity. However, in private, their lives were diverging rapidly. Rudolph resumed his visits to brothels, maintained mistresses, and drank heavily. His emotional instability intensified, and his behavior became erratic. He veered between affectionate charm and cold detachment. Stephanie, meanwhile, lived in confusion. She sensed something was wrong but had no language, education, or support system to understand the depth of the problem. In the imperial court, a wife was expected to endure, not inquire. In 1886, 5 years into her marriage, Stephanie's world shattered completely. It started with unexplained pain, inflammation, and fatigue. Doctors, bound by discretion and patriarchal norms, offered little clarity. It was eventually confirmed. She had contracted gonorrhea. The disease had been passed to her by her own husband, likely from one of his countless illicit encounters. In a world without antibiotics, the consequences were catastrophic. Gonorrhea in women was not just a temporary infection. Left untreated, it often migrated to the reproductive organs, causing pelvic inflammatory disease, leading to chronic pain, internal scarring, and sterility. Stephanie's body would never recover. She was just 22 years old, and her ability to bear children was over. The psychological blow hit just as hard. In the royal hierarchy, a woman's worth was tied directly to her fertility. Producing heirs was not only a duty but the very purpose of her existence in the eyes of her husband, the court, and society. The disease was an emotional sentence as much as a medical one. And yet, there was no support. No sympathy. Rudolph never admitted fault. In fact, he blamed Stephanie for not producing a male heir. His attitude shifted from indifference to cruelty. Their marriage, already strained, descended into open resentment. They lived increasingly separate lives, united only by occasional appearances for court events. Rumors swirled through Viennese salons. Everyone had a theory. Some whispered that Stephanie had been cursed or poisoned. Others suggested she had been infected by a servant or midwife. Few dared to suggest the truth, that the very heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne had infected his wife with a venereal disease. The reality was too scandalous, too disruptive. It challenged the foundations of royal purity, male superiority, and public decorum. Stephanie, though crushed, began to awaken. Her bitterness grew. During a visit to Galatia, she engaged in an affair with a Polish count, her first taste of romantic defiance. But her reputation, already damaged, sank further in court gossip. Rudolph's decline, meanwhile, accelerated. His drinking increased. He reportedly dabbled in drugs. He continued to pursue younger women, often in disturbing circumstances. One of these was 17-year-old Baroness Mary Vetsera, who became his mistress. Their relationship, heavily imbalanced in age and power, would become fatal. On January 30, 1889, both Rudolph and Mary were found dead in a remote hunting lodge at Marling. The official explanation was a double suicide. Rudolph, in a state of despair, had shot Mary and then himself. The imperial family scrambled to contain the fallout. The Marling Incident was a disaster. The heir was dead, scandal enveloped the palace, and conspiracy theories flooded Europe. Some believed it was a political assassination. Others whispered about secret pacts and cover-ups. But for Stephanie, it was both a tragedy and a release. At 24, she was a widow, free from the marriage that had wrecked her body and soul. Yet freedom came at a price. She remained in Austria, attached to the court through her daughter and her title. Public sympathy was minimal. Her infertility was still whispered about. Many held her responsible for failing to give Austria a male heir. No one acknowledged that the true failure lay with Rudolph, not only for transmitting disease but for destroying their marriage with selfishness and cruelty. Stephanie eventually left court life. In 1900, she remarried, this time for love. Her new husband was Count Elémir Lányé, a Hungarian nobleman of much lower rank. The marriage was morganatic, meaning she lost her imperial titles and her daughter's court privileges were affected. But Stephanie didn't care. She wanted peace. They lived a quiet life in Hungary, away from the noise of empires and the glare of royal obligations. But the shadows of her past never left. She bore no more children. The disease had ensured that. The trauma lingered in her body. The betrayal festered in her mind. Her place in history remained that of a failed consort. A silent victim. A tragic footnote. Yet her life offers more than that. It reveals a larger story. A pattern of how powerful men in gilded palaces destroyed the futures of the women they married through negligence, deception, and disease. Stephanie's tragedy was not an accident. It was a consequence of a system that prioritized image over truth, dynasty over dignity, and male privilege over female well-being. Stephanie of Belgium's tragic story is not just a personal account but a mirror reflecting the systemic cruelty faced by royal women of the 19th century. Her pain, her infertility, and the public shame she endured were not isolated incidents but common outcomes in a world where women were traded like treaties and sacrificed for dynastic continuity. What made it particularly cruel was the silence surrounding it all. Sexually transmitted diseases like gonorrhea and syphilis were rampant among aristocratic men. From France to Russia, from Prussia to England, noblemen routinely visited brothels, kept mistresses, and returned to their marital beds without a word. The diseases they contracted were often hidden, and their consequences were suffered by their unsuspecting wives. These women were rarely educated about reproduction or disease. It was considered inappropriate, even vulgar, to inform princesses and duchesses about such things. Modesty was demanded, but ignorance was enforced. And so, when symptoms appeared, pelvic pain, miscarriages, infertility, the women suffered in silence. The doctors, sworn to discretion, often colluded in keeping the truth hidden. Sometimes they diagnosed inflammations or hysteria, blaming the very woman who had been infected. Society was built to protect male reputations and sacrifice female futures. In this world, Princess Stephanie was not the only infected royal. Historical archives hint at several princesses, duchesses, and queens who lived with chronic illness, hidden from history. But they were almost never allowed to speak about it. Stephanie's marriage was a tragedy orchestrated not just by fate but by a deeply flawed royal culture. Her father had used her as a political token. Her husband had used her as a shield for his own guilt. The court used her as a scapegoat for dynastic failure. Even her daughter, Elizabeth Marie, grew up in the shadow of scandal. Elizabeth's relationship with her mother was distant, even cold. The emotional trauma Stephanie carried, the bitterness from betrayal, may have made her a stern and melancholic parent. She had survived the imperial system, but it had hollowed her out. Her remarriage brought personal peace but no redemption in the eyes of the royal world. For the rest of her life, Stephanie lived on the margins of power. No longer a princess of Austria, no longer an agent of political strategy, she faded from public memory. Yet behind this fading lay a powerful testimony. Her very existence challenged the myth of royal perfection. Her medical history disrupted the fantasy of fairy tale marriages. Her silence revealed the cost of loyalty in a system built on hypocrisy. The very same empires that dressed their women in diamonds allowed their bodies to be used, diseased, and discarded without consequence. The infected princess became a living reminder that the greatest threats to royal women came not from political assassins but from the men they were forced to marry. This was not merely a case of marital betrayal. It was biological warfare under the veil of arranged love. Gonorrhea was the weapon. Ignorance was the method. Silence was the shield. And women like Stephanie were the casualties. When Princess Stephanie died on August 23, 1945, at the age of 81, she had witnessed the collapse of everything she had once been destined to uphold. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was long gone. The Belgian monarchy had changed irreversibly. 2 world wars had reshaped Europe. And the gilded imperial age of arranged marriages, court dances, and dynastic heirs had faded into history. She had outlived her husband, her father, and even many who had whispered about her shame. But her legacy remained shadowed, incomplete. For decades, her story was filtered through the lens of failure. The consort who could not give Austria a son, the foreign princess who never truly belonged, the widow of the doomed crown prince. But time has begun to reevaluate her. Modern historians now see Stephanie not as a failed royal, but as a victim of deeply entrenched patriarchal systems. She was not sterile by nature. She was sterilized by neglect and betrayal. She was not cold or bitter by personality. She was shaped by abandonment, disease, and blame. Her tragedy was not of her own making. And in recognizing that, we find the deeper truth her story offers. It is a warning about what happens when knowledge is denied, when power is unchecked, and when women are silenced for the comfort of men. Stephanie's daughter, Elizabeth Marie, did go on to have children, ensuring the Habsburg line continued. Ironically, the disease that robbed Stephanie of her reproductive power did not prevent her bloodline from surviving. But the emotional inheritance, the silence, the blame, the confusion, lingered across generations. Even today, few know Stephanie's full story. The Marling tragedy often dominates accounts of her life, with Rudolph portrayed as the tragic hero. But when viewed through modern eyes, Rudolph is far less tragic and far more culpable. He was a man who used his privilege to indulge recklessly, then shifted the consequences onto the innocent. Stephanie, in contrast, was a survivor. She lived through betrayal, public humiliation, imperial collapse, and war. She rebuilt her life outside the palace, beyond the golden cages that had once confined her. And though she bore the physical scars of disease, she also carried the moral clarity of truth, a clarity that history is only now beginning to recognize. Her story is not just a scandal. It is a case study in injustice. A chronicle of how patriarchal institutions fail their most loyal servants. A plea for compassion in reading the past. The infected princess was not a symbol of shame. She was a symbol of endurance. Her tragedy teaches us that the most devastating royal dramas are not those of war and rebellion, but those that unfold quietly, in bedrooms, in doctors' chambers, in whispered gossip, and behind closed doors. Diseases can be cured, but the systems that enable their spread and silence their victims are far more dangerous. Stephanie's voice may have been silenced in her lifetime, but her story can now be told, not as a curiosity, but as a call to remember. Remember the women whose lives were broken by arranged alliances. Remember the princesses whose bodies were battlegrounds. Remember that even in palaces, abuse hides behind protocol. And remember that justice, though delayed, begins with truth. The infected princess was not broken. She was betrayed. And through the telling of her story, she lives not as a victim, but as a warning. You've just witnessed one of the darkest punishments in history. But many more still lurk in the shadows. So if you dare, subscribe to Torture Vault, where every scream from the past still echoes.